Welcome. I'm John Henry, Chairman of the Committee for the Republic. I want to point your attention here to our new poster, Make the Constitution Great Again, Make Congress Great Again. That's our battle cry. American greatness begins and ends with the Constitution. American exceptionalism is constitutional exceptionalism. The Constitution gives the rule of law rather than the law of the jungle. Gives us the rule of law rather than the law of the jungle, where the strong do what they will and the weak accept what they must. The Constitution makes Congress the dominant, not a co-equal branch of government. No legislative body in history has been given more power. And as the poster that we had last time and is behind me shows you, if Congress and the President fail to make separation of powers a reality, the Constitution is in flames. So this salon season, we've been focusing on trying to take a closer look at the breakdown of separation of powers, presidential wars, impeachable offenses, executive orders, pardons. Tonight, we're examining the obligation that the Constitution imposes on the President to faithfully execute the laws. James Madison had to say this about his separation of powers invention. I quote, "Knowledge will forever govern ignorance, and people who mean to be their own governors must arm themselves with the power which knowledge gives." Separation of powers is the guarantor of peace. Separation of powers is the guarantee of liberty. Separation of powers is the guarantor of justice. Indeed, we can say without reservation that separation of powers is to enlighten government what Newton's laws of motion are to physics. Now, separation of powers depends on faithful execution of the laws. President Washington observed that, and I quote, "It is my duty to see that the laws are executed. To permit them to be trampled upon with impunity would be repugnant." Close quote. The United States grew from an acorn to a giant oak by practicing separation of powers. Then came the forcible annexation of Hawaii in the Spanish-American War, and the long and steady process of dismantling separation of powers brick by brick. Today, we crown the President with more unchecked power than King George III exercised during the time of the American Revolution. Now, it isn't an accident that I've made my vice chairman the country's leading constitutional lawyer on separation of powers, Bruce Fein. Before Bruce tells us why the Take Care Clause is the cornerstone of separation of powers, I would like to leave you with this brief sentiment that was inspired by John of Gaunt's death speech in Shakespeare's Richard II. "Our land of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, this deepest seat of constitutionalism, where the war power is denied the executive and only the legislature can end our state of peace. This fortress built by nature for us against foreign invasion and the menace of war. This vast continent, bookended by the world's largest oceans, which protects us like a castle moat against the envy of less happier lands. This brave new world of immigrants, bound by our Constitution and faithful to the rule of law. This paradise for entrepreneurs, where doing things differently can win limitless rewards. This energetic economy that attracts the world's talent. This beloved republic, this city on the hill, this United States of America. Famous for our deeds far from home, for the freedom of our citizens to march to their own drummer. This land of opportunity, this dear, dear republic. Dear for our shining example around the world, dear for our aspiring reputation for justice. Is now, behold, so swamped in endless war and skyrocketing debt, so mired in mutual recrimination by the Democratic and Republican parties, so distracted by the ceaseless games of blame, so frightened by their exaggerated victim narratives, so deafened by the relentless drumbeat of identity politics, so addicted by their militarism, so enslaved by the siren call of empire, so endangered by their entangling alliances. America, bound by our constitutional exceptionalism, whose separation of powers held the tyranny of the one, the few, and the many at bay, is now bound by shame, ruled by the law of the jungle, where the strong do what they will and the weak accept what they must. That has strangled the greatest experiment in self-government the world has ever known, and turned Congress and the courts into an inkblot of an imperial presidency, and reduced us from confident citizens to fearful subjects. That the United States that once conquered the hearts of the world is now busy committing suicide and making ourselves a shameful conquest of ourselves. Thank you.
Thank you for the introduction, John. I want to begin in a little different way to stress the importance of courage to everything that we do. It was Aristotle who said, without courage, it is the summit of virtues because no others are possible without it. I make that observation in part because as a lawyer I see very large law firms displaying cowardice and cravenness when they're attacked by President Trump, threatened with unconstitutional retaliation, if not extortion, if they don't offer $100 million of free legal services to pursue endeavors that Mr. Trump identifies. So all the intellect in the world, all understanding of the world doesn't really amount to anything unless you're courageous and willing to fight and die for those rights. And that's important because we oftentimes neglect that understanding. I recently was at the Harvard Law Forum. Virtually no, this is the day that President Trump announced $9 billion was in jeopardy for Harvard because he didn't echo his love for himself. The narcissism didn't quite reach the threshold needed to avoid retaliation. And the turnout is very, very slim, largely indifference. Everyone is preoccupied with their grades and where they're going to be working in the summer. I said, if the Constitution goes up in flames, your Harvard law degree is worth nothing. Who's going to pay you to walk into a court whose judgments can't be enforced? You think lawyers are millionaires in China or Russia, and you're sitting idling, focused on the rule against perpetuities and not separation of powers? It's very, very difficult to awaken them to their peril. And to say it's shown in the way not all law firms, but many of the very largest ones have really displayed themselves unfaithful to their obligations as lawyers and the rule of law. Now, the second irregular introduction is unlike referencing Shakespeare, who, by the way, celebrated the monarchs of the Tudors, including Henry V. He was wonderful before Agincourt, but it was still undeclared wars, killing for the sake of killing. So I think that it's more appropriate, I summon William Henry Longfellow. He's American, not British, to, I think, give the tone that ought to earmark this session tonight. And he wrote, "Listen, my children, and you shall hear of the midnight ride of Paul Revere. On the 18th of April in 75, hardly a man is now alive who remembers that famous day and year. He said to his friend, if the British march by land or by sea to the town tonight, hang a lantern atop the belfry of the North Church Tower as a signal light. One if by land, two if by sea, and I at the opposite shore shall be. Ready to ride and send the alarm through every Middlesex village and farm, to the country vote, to be up and to arm. That should thrill everyone. That's the sacrifices that our forefathers made. We are not confronted with that level of danger right now, but we will be unless we awaken to the alarm. Now, the separation of powers, said, finds perhaps one of its greatest expressions not only in the war power, but in the obligation of the president to faithfully execute the laws. We oftentimes talk about presidential powers. There are also presidential responsibilities. Now, as in most cases, a few sentences of history speaks volumes of logic. Where did the Take Care Clause come from? Came from the English Bill of Rights of 1689. King James II was refusing to enforce laws, especially against Catholics, that he didn't like. So the Parliament passed the English Bill of Rights saying that is illegal and wrong, and Mr. King James persisted and he lost his throne. That was the reason for the Take Care Clause. And we can understand why if we think about things that are happening today. Mr. Trump has said that he's not going to enforce the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act. Well, what does that mean? It means that the act passed by Congress now is null and void. Who else is going to enforce it? Either the government does it or nobody. It's the equivalent of an absolute veto on a law. Suppose he decided not to denounce, he didn't want to enforce the federal criminal code, at least as regards the crimes that he thought his political friends might be subject to. There isn't any legal remedy in the way which we think you go into court and file a lawsuit. The courts have said those are political questions. So what is left for enforcing the Take Care Clause? Impeachment. That was understood, at least in my time, when President Richard Nixon was under scrutiny by the House for impeachable offenses. He was refusing to enforce the laws relating to the Watergate burglary. Among other things, too, the obligation to spend money appropriated by Congress, which that time led to the Impoundment Control Act. So we do have a precedent where violating the Take Care Clause amounts to an impeachable offense. But really, that's just a very, very tiny tip of the iceberg. When we think of the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act. All of the things that Elon Musk is doing to dismantle government agencies basically make them defunct. Fires all the lawyers, all the employees, or says, I'm not going to spend any money, don't show up for work. You can still get a little bit of money. Congress created all these agencies. You'll not see in Article 2 any authority of the president to create an agency. They're all the handiwork of Congress. And these are being dismantled. Most of the courts are saying these decisions are illegal, but you don't know how irreparable the harm in the interim is going to be. It takes a long time and expense to go up to the Courts of Appeals, the U.S. Supreme Court. So if the president can just decide he doesn't want to enforce any law, he basically has an absolute ability to shut down the whole government. Say, I'm not sending out any attorneys. They're not going to walk into court. And you'll see that in part, if you remember, the way in which the Eric Adams indictment was dismissed. He just said, okay, we're going to not have any lawyers prosecute the case. It'll go away. The judge said, I don't have any authority to do otherwise. Even though it smacked of extortion, if you will. The idea was, if Eric Adams helped with regard to immigration and deportation, then the indictment would be dismissed. And that's just one ramification. And one of the ones that happened on January 20th, on Inauguration Day, President Trump announced, I'm not going to enforce the congressional ban on TikTok. It had a waiting period before it took effect on January 19th, to allow TikTok to seek to find a buyer that would not be subject to the Chinese control that led to Congress to enact the ban. And Mr. Trump issued an executive order. First he said, for 75 days, I'm not going to enforce the law. Then a few days ago, he said, now there's another 75 days. Now, I challenge anybody to find any standard by which you decide how many more days he can extend the withholding of the enforcement of the law. And what's remarkable is Congress is very, very passive. They see themselves totally handcuffed by the executive branch and sits idle and walks. I see the high water mark of their protests. They write letters to Biden or to Trump. Gee, how come you're not enforcing this law? We really think you should respect us. There's no, I say, why don't you say you're going to cut off funds? Why don't you say you're going to impeach him if he doesn't do? No, we don't want to do that. It'd be bad manners. He's the kind of the king. Not only does he say he's the king, he even puts it up on his websites. You remember after he decided he wanted to shut down the New York congestion pricing program, he's had a picture of him. He had a crown on. It says, King Trump. We know what goes through his head because when he's trying to explain the justification for his actions, who does he summon? James Madison? Jefferson? Napoleon? If you're saving your country, you violate no law. Really? Napoleon is fighting wars at the time of the Constitution being drafted. You're citing Napoleon? Well, at least he didn't do Caligula. He said, I can do anything I want to whomever I want. But Napoleon wasn't far from that. Bob Randolph has it right. Make impeachment great again. Because ultimately, the courts, at best, can impose speed bumps. They're not our savior or deliverance. So it moves, at best, at lead-footed speed. And mostly it's glacial. So long, so expensive. And the country is destroyed in the interim. Congress, of course, has now become an ornament. Style it like the Roman Senate under Augustus. That Senate, the Roman Senate's chief mission was to deify the emperor. They competed to see who could get deified first. That's how much legislative power remained in the Roman Senate. And the only way Congress will become awakened to their obligation to impeachment is if we write and say, wait a minute, the process is broken. It is your obligation to fire the CEO. The CEO is not doing his job. I say one of the reasons I believe that the country is so fearful about the I word, if you will, is because they've been duped into thinking it's like the guillotine in the French Revolution. Really? The guillotine? That happened to Richard Nixon. He went and became an elder statesman, San Clemente. He had a nice life. Impeachment is just you're removed from office. You're not going to jail. No fine. You just can't be trusted. You're no longer a trustworthy steward of our liberties and the Constitution. That's all it is. It's hard to imagine a more gentle way in which you remove the chief executive. Yet you have all these allegations that we're like third world countries if we impeach presidents. And I can tell you, if you impeach one and have him removed once, you won't need to do it for hundreds of years. People who gravitate to politics crave power. They'll do anything to stay in power. Shift their views 180 degrees. Like J.D. Vance went from calling Mr. Trump Adolf Hitler to saying, my God, he's now the Pope or even higher than the Pope because he liked power. There's a new book out called, I think, it's about the race to the White House in 2024. It recounts Biden's withdrawal of Kamala Harris and the race there. If you want to understand the political personality of sociopaths, everybody's maneuvering back. Who's going to get credit for this and that? Barack Obama, Biden won't talk to him because he thinks Obama undercut him. Kamala Harris is no longer on speaking terms with Obama because he didn't come out in favor. He wanted primaries. All these efforts really were ego battles. It had nothing to do with any policy of any sort. But let's go to other ramifications of the obligation to faithfully execute the laws. One of them that's really been unmentioned, it is kind of normalized, it's what the lawyers call presidential signing statements. I, in fact, served on the American Bar Association Commission on Presidential Signing Statements, and we authored a very long monograph explaining why they were unconstitutional. And what Congress should do is when the president appends a signing statement to a bill, says there's no money to execute it. So what is a signing statement? The president will sign a bill by Congress, and he'll point out particular passages. He says, I think that these provisions are unconstitutional. You're tying my hands in El Salvador. You're not letting me send troops to Greenland. You're not letting me go to war on my own. So I will treat these as advisory only because I think you're encroaching on my powers. Now, you think that there would be a conflict of interest because you're telling, or the president's claiming, I'm deciding what my powers are. Now, that ordinarily, for at least 500 years, in Anglo-American jurisprudence, we don't let a man be a judge in his own case. And those are not very trustworthy statements. And what also presidents fail to recognize is our very first president, George Washington, said, when he was confronted with a bill, even the first ones were log rolling between Hamilton and Jefferson about moving the capital to Washington, D.C., the tariffs would be accepted, and various and sundry things. I need to sign the bill in whole or veto it in whole. I can't pick and choose. There's no line item veto. And the reason, in part, was to make sure that Congress had leverage over the president. They could mix the good and the bad, and the president have to sign it all or not. So he can veto it and ask the Congress to change it, but he can't pick and choose which ones he likes. Indeed, the United States Supreme Court, in a case called Clinton versus New York, it arose in a different context. This was in 1998, at a time when Congress was also eagerly surrendering its power. So it said, listen, we don't know how to do budgets. Let's just tell the president you can do a line item veto, not spend money that you don't like to spend, because we don't want the responsibility. The Supreme Court said you can't do that. You can't give away this responsibility because it's important that we have electors accountable to the people make these decisions. You can't give it to the president. But these signing statements are the equivalent of that. It just says, and it's worse than just a veto, because in a veto situation, the president sends a bill back to the House and Senate to be overridden by 2/3 majority. When he says a signing statement, that's it. The provision is just out, not enforceable. It becomes decorative, and that's all. And this is notorious with presidents. Every time they think Congress, less today than it used to, would feel their oats and try to stipulate that we should not go abroad in search of monsters to destroy and place limits on the president's power to engage in combat without a declaration of war. And now this has become so normalized, the press doesn't even report it, the signing statements. Charlie Savage of the New York Times once wrote a book. There's literally thousands of signing statements that he was able, I think he won a Pulitzer Prize for that had started to spiral in the last decades. So we oftentimes, or the administration thinks of the power to enforce the law kind of offensively, weaponization of law enforcement. And there's no doubt that that is a danger. Again, I always come back to the fact that the real problem why we have such a distorted constitutional framework is congressional indolence and cravenness, because the framers anticipated that Congress would step up, wouldn't wait for the courts. Congress would be the one to hold the executive to account through impeachment or the power of the purse or otherwise. And that simply doesn't happen today for the various reasons that we've explained. Impeachment, say, is different because Congress doesn't need to worry about any other branch interfering. Begins in the House, goes to the Senate, there's a trial, the judiciary doesn't intervene, the executive branch has no role in the impeachment process, and that's how the framers intended our system of government to work. Now, I want to amplify on why the framers conferred the majority of power on Congress, not the executive. What does that reflect of their vision of why we have government? They knew, the framers knew, certainly Madison especially, he started sitting in legislative offices at age 25, and he wrote the Constitution at age 36. Say he was like the Mozart of politics. The framers knew two things. One, that the goal of government, as expressed in the Declaration of Independence, was to secure unalienable rights to life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness. And that was to be secured by government by the consent of the governed. Why would they give the preponderance of power to the legislative branch? Because they knew it's largely a talking shop, but it has very, very useful attributes to it. It's transparent. It's deliberative. It's not reckless. It gets nothing out of going to war, especially, because it shrinks to an inkblot in wartime. And you're trying to build, even within the legislative branch, checks and balances that don't exist in the executive branch. Executive branch, you get president tells somebody this, everybody marches to their own drummer, decides they have, not to their own drummer, they have to stay on page that the president tells them. There's no internal debate, which is why the president makes staggering errors all the time, because everyone wants to tell the president what he hears. But Congress doesn't operate that way. They have various committees, they have hearings, they have deliberation, you have talk, you have the ability of input. I mean, you or me right now can go walk into congressional offices and sit down and say, well, I'd like to have a meeting. You know, I feel this way. You think you can go to the White House and do that? No way. So you're more accessible. And the other thing the framers understood is that there is a presumption, if you have an unalienable right to liberty, that government desists. Because every time government does something, and sometimes it has to, it encroaches on liberty. But we understand some things we don't want you to have liberty to do, like commit murder, rape, rob, commit fraud. So you have to have government in some respects. But they knew that the presumption should be against government activity. Gridlock to them, we use this as a pejorative today. To them, it was something to be applauded. That means we need to continue to debate. Maybe we're going down the wrong road. And since the goal of the country at that time was liberty, it wasn't Madeleine Albright, we need to dominate the whole world. We see farther than any other country, and we only fight for angelic reasons, and my gosh, we can't have any limits on presidential power. And she wasn't the first time. If you wanted the worst, I think, exponent of this idea was Albert Beveridge. He was a senator from Indiana who was celebrating our conquest of the Philippines. And this is his words. He said, when we wrote in the Declaration of Independence that you should have government by the consent of the governed, that only meant for white people who are smart. The Filipinos and Malays, they're stupid, they're barbarians. It wasn't meant for them. It's a disgrace that we should believe that they have the right to govern themselves. So that attitude comes in, and so it replaces the idea that liberty, the dignity of each individual, was what marks us as a great nation. Not telling other people what to do, going in, shooting drones at them, occupying their land, and otherwise. So that's why we have the legislative body at the outset being supreme. And by and large, the legislature acted as the framers intended. You see, now with all these executive regulations, it's like there are 200,000 regulations. Look at the federal statute books. For the first 100 years, you probably put them in a pocket. Very relatively few. It certainly was far from perfect because mankind's made of crooked timber, so no matter what system you have, it's going to be imperfect. So we're looking for the optimal. What's better than all the alternatives? And they knew the alternative of a monarch was going to be horrible, terrible, whether it's King George III or Caligula or Claudius or anyone else, because limitless power turns individuals mad. Read Suetonius' 12 Caesars. All the young Caesars, when they're babies, they're all angelic, told they're such a kindly baby, and then they turn with limitless power. They're monsters the next day. That happens to virtually everyone, with very, very rare exceptions that you can't count on. So that's why we want the legislative body to be dominant, because it's going to secure our liberties, despite the fact that they surely are going to make errors. I'm not a fool to think you have everybody as a genius there in the Congress and they're acting for angelic motives. They aren't, but they're competing, they're transparent, there are limitations on what they will do. that you don't find in the executive branch. There, the president decides that's it. If you go off the reservation, boom, you're fired. Just like even most recently, we saw a lawyer was removed from his weak or anemic defense of the Alien Enemies Act when he says, I really don't know, why the president thinks this Venezuela gang is dropping bombs on us. Well, the Attorney General says through Mr. Trump, you're not defending the president strongly enough. You're gone. So say everybody's got to be on the same page, and that leads to disasters like Vietnam. Anyone who lived through the Vietnam War knows that there was all this internal dissent. George Ball, it never got anyplace. They kept telling him, listen, there's no light at the end of the tunnel, no matter what General Westmoreland says, but they would never say it publicly, and so we just rolled off of a cliff because it was not public. So the reason why I think it's important to focus on the underlying personalities of the legislatures, separation of powers isn't just a theory that you memorize and say it sounds good. Because it relates to the underlying way politicians act and political institutions act. And we know that you take the power out of the legislative branch, say we're Republican or Democrat, and give it to the executive branch, you're out of control. You're out of control. I talk so many people I talked to just at the time when President Bush wanted to invade, he decided to invade Iraq. Said there are people telling, no, they're not going to throw flowers in Baghdad. No, it's not a city on a hill in Babylon that you're going to approach. They said they couldn't get to see the president. Said, no, you can't tell them this is going to be other than a cakewalk. And we see what happened. So I think that and if you read the papers, you know how many different agencies, whether it's USAID, Department of Education, U.S. Peace Institute, Kennedy Center, the Smithsonian now, President just decides he's going to shut down on his own. And these are all institutions that I say are creatures of Congress. And you can see that without good faith, the system doesn't work. Because you can technically say, or Mr. Trump could say, well, there's still an education department. It's just that it's like a ghost town. No one shows up. All the employees are gone. We don't have them enforce any laws, but they're there. So you can't let form triumph over substance. So we can go in the question and answer session in more detail about particular laws that you want to raise. But I do not believe that this kind of attack on separation can be successful. Can be defeated without Congress stepping up and saying, we're going to remove you from office if you continue this. Now, I would be the first one to say that in some sense, to do that now is an unfairness to whoever is the incumbent. Because impeachable offenses have gone on so long with impunity, Democrats and Republicans, somebody can stand up, no matter Trump, well, why didn't you do this with Biden? He was violating laws too. I have an outstanding case I brought against the Ley Law. There are all these limits on providing weapons to countries engaged in serious violations of human rights and warfare. Biden would just ignore them all. We had someone who quit the Biden administration for this reason. So there's some justice in saying, well, how come you're doing it now? You didn't do it with all these other presidents who did equally horrible things. And the only answer is, it's partial answer is, we understand that. There's an unfairness. But you got to start somewhere. You cannot legalize something by repetition. If somebody commits 100 murders, he doesn't say, hey, 100 murders, I escaped 101. You can't prosecute me anymore. Okay? Well, maybe he shouldn't have escaped the 101, the first 100. But otherwise, the whole system collapses. And that's where we are today. Unfortunately, because the politics is so polarized, anytime you impeach anybody, they'll say, see, it's political, it's partisan. Because you didn't do it with Obama, you didn't do it with Clinton, you didn't do it with Bush, so the reason now is just politics. Isn't because you really care that a president committed impeachable offenses. And in some sense, that's true. But that's all we got to deal with up there. That's all we got to deal with up there. Now, all those Democrats, we tried to get them to stand up to Biden, his claim that he could go to war with China on his own, and the undeclared co-belligerency in Israel and Ukraine and other smaller countries. Democrats wouldn't say anything against Biden. You know, look at and at that time, they were protesting the nationwide injunctions that were issued against Biden's effort repeatedly to kind of cancel student loans. And he would go back 30 times, rewrite it. Second time, like Trump trying to stop immigrants, you know, he had to go back to the working group 3 or 4 times. But Biden did the same thing. When he keeps getting slapped back by the courts, well, I'll rewrite it and we'll try it again. The Democrats then were protesting nationwide injunctions against what's Biden doing. Now the same thing's happening to Trump, and they're silent, and the Republicans complain. So, and I focus on this because it's so hard to get, you know, the country focused on the merits of any issue without always accusing someone of having ulterior motives. Well, you do it because you hate X or Y, which then deflects attention to what the substance of the issue is. And that's a real barrier that we have, and the media contributes to that. Everything is personality. Somebody said this, somebody said that, and it's not focused on really what's best for the American people and the system at large. And I would hope that this group would say, wait, we're about process, whether it's Democrats, Republicans, Independents, or otherwise, because that's our only salvation. We are very close to having the Constitution taken off of life support. I would be stunned if, before the year ends, we're in far greater peril than we are now. It may be because there'd be a violation of a Supreme Court order or something like that. And I fear that, unlike the time of Watergate, I've repeated 30,000 telegrams came in every day saying you cannot fire the special prosecutor and refuse to surrender tapes, and Nixon backed down. I don't see anything happen today. Those members of Congress are not getting those telegrams, emails, whatever. The last time they got that, it worked, 2013. Everyone wrote into Congress and said, no, do not give President Obama the power to go to war with Syria. It's not going to happen. We don't want to go down another misadventure, another rabbit hole. Congress killed the whole bill. But that's 12 years ago. A fair amount has happened in those 12 years. And I keep saying, we're the last guardrail. Let's make sure that we listen to Paul Revere's ride and emulate those who heard Paul Revere send the alarm throughout Middlesex County. Thanks.
So Bruce, if you would you rather live in a country where all the policies went against you, but they were legal, or versus where you liked the policies and they were illegal?
Well, I think, John, you have a snapshot that probably doesn't completely correspond to life.
Sure.
That is, I certainly would choose between the two. I'd rather have the rule of law, even if I ended up on the short stick at that particular time. But the whole reason why I want the rule of law is because I have an opportunity to change people's minds. And maybe they'll come around to the way I think. I don't want to have people do things just because, you know, I've got a king. You got to bring them along. That's part of what, you know, respecting everybody else's dignity is. And so I think the reason why I amplify it is that even though I would say, sure, I prefer living in a government where there's law, even if I could get my policies in the short run without law, because number one, I want to have the opportunity to try to change people's mind. And number two, even if I like those policies, that guy is not going to live forever. What happens when the successor comes in? He's not going to be a clone. And then pretty soon, I'm going to be the target. So I don't want to take that risk, which is what happens when you rely just upon a king.
Right, because I have a good friend who's very right of center, and I said to him, well, I said, why didn't it, you know, this didn't come up, cutting the size of government, right? He said, we should have debated this in the election. If you don't think we should be running 25% of the GDP through the federal government, as I do, I don't think we should be doing that. I'd like to do a fraction of that, but it wasn't debated.
No.
At all. And my friend said, well, Trump was too smart to do that, because if he brought that up, that, you know, it wouldn't have helped him get reelected. So,
that's the wrong way to think about politics. I mean, politics is a collective effort. It's not just one person. You don't have elections and then, like a plebiscite, you rule without any public input. I mean, part of the purpose of politics is dialogue, consensus. Maybe you have it wrong. You want to listen. And the process itself provides dignity to everybody who's engaged. Well, I want to listen to your voice. What do you think? I may agree or disagree, but I'll certainly listen to you. I mean, that is what makes a country and a society great. We don't have hierarchy, kings, queens, lords, baronesses, and whatever. We take everybody based upon their character and their accomplishments, and everybody's equal, and we want to listen to you. And that's why you wouldn't even want, a system, even if that gave you everything for free and you didn't have to do anything on your own. They just happened to come up with those policies. No one really acquires, I think, pride and self-esteem and respect unless they work for it. We're not stupid. We have interiors to recognize if you just got a windfall. And part of the goal of politics is, we give you second chances, but you have to work for it. And we encourage you. But ultimately, it resolves on the individual. And unfortunately, that concept, that understanding, I think, that was prevalent at the time of the founding is kind of gone away. We just want, hey, everybody else should do something for us, and everyone's maneuvering to get some kind of artificial edge.
Where's let's take some questions here. There's the lady.
This
Oh, we got right over here. There's Mr. Erickson.
Bruce, listening to that, I had to go back to Madison. Another thing he said that, if I'm right, what little I studied the Constitution, if I remember right, he was the one who came up with the idea that democracies fail when they form factions, and that was the start of the whole thing. So, it seems surprising if there isn't, but was anything written into the Constitution to preclude the formation of political parties?
Well, what Madison wrote about, it's in Federalist 10, he knew that factions were inevitable because he sat in legislative bodies. But he said if you have a particular size of district, that you would have competing factions so that one could dominate against another. And that was his idea of when he mentions pitting ambition against ambition. So he wasn't deluded in thinking, but he wasn't thinking in terms of factions relating to political parties. He was saying a debtor and creditor class. It was more economic or religious factions than political party loyalties. I think that the reason why there wasn't any focus on the danger of political parties, because the framers were quite aware of the Whigs and the Tories in Great Britain, and they could see the rivalries there that debased the British Empire, was because George Washington was so overwhelmingly dominant. Yeah. Remember, he won every single electoral vote twice, and despite the fact he didn't want to serve, not only once, he didn't want to serve twice, that it kind of suppressed, and no one really wanted to say as soon as Washington goes, this is going to break out into factions, and we need to safeguard against that. Although it's true, if you read George Washington's farewell address, he goes out of his way to say, we do not want political factions. We do not want political parties. It's going to be the bane of our existence. We just need to comply with the Constitution. If it's erroneous, we need to amend it. But parties, he thought, would be terrible. Because he could see, at least before his second term ended, the emergence of the parties between the Federalists and the Democrat Republicans with the Hamiltonian wing, and then Jefferson and Madison another. And he was trying to exhort the country against it. Unfortunately, it really didn't happen. By the time John Adams became the second president, you already had the division became even more acute under Jefferson. And that's why, one of the reasons I think you can see why they didn't anticipate factions is the way the Constitution was initially drafted, the vice president got the second most votes of the president, and he became vice president. So, and I think the reason why they thought that, well, listen, if they're all basically on the same page, the vice president will really be very similar to the president. Well, it was all right with George Washington. John Adams was a shadow of George Washington, so there wasn't any real conflict. But John Adams, he beat John Thomas Jefferson by 3 electoral votes. And Jefferson was his political opposite in 1796. So that I think predicate soon proved to be false, and that political parties did emerge. I do not think they have the same acuity as we witness today. That's why in Thomas Jefferson's first inaugural, he said, we're all Republicans, we're all Federalists, because even though we may disagree with regard to details, in principle, we all understand we subscribe to the Constitution of the United States of America. Now, one of the reasons why, and maybe it's the dominant reason why, the parties have become so much more polarized, so much more bitter, is because the stakes of the presidential race is so much greater, even the stakes of the congressional races. Because we started out, the government, talking about 25% around DMP, the government is a really, really, really small component of the country. A handful of agencies, budgets maybe a couple $100,000, no standing army. And we were, at that time, of course, we were just a tinier eastern seaboard country. So winning the presidency wasn't like, hey, the ticket to make $500,000 speeches and selling Teslas on the front lawn of the White House and capitalizing in a million other ways. It's not just that. Everybody does the same thing. I mean, Ronald Reagan got $2 million speeches. Obama's the same. And so it's just the nature of power in attracting what I call sociopaths, that now the stakes, you're talking about a presidency. His budget is $7 trillion that he has control over. Millions of employees. The ability to make or break people's finances. I mean, look what's happened in the last few days with the tariffs. They go up, they go down. Stock market jumps by 20. People probably lost fortunes and made fortunes in the last 24, 48 hours just because of what the president did. So when the stakes are as high as they are now, as opposed to the modest stakes at the initial, then people will become far more dastardly. Hey, it's one thing to rob a piggy bank. It's another to go into Fort Knox and get all the gold bars, right? So you're going to get a lot worse people trying to go into Fort Knox than stealing piggy bank pennies. And that's one of the side effects of the growth of the federal government into a leviathan. You're getting the willingness to subscribe to ethical precepts becomes much, much less. Look at the golden prize there. I mean, that's why when you look historically at countries where you don't have even elections, the Ottoman Empire, the Sultan would kill all of his relatives because he didn't want anybody to vie for the power, which was limitless. And that, I think, explains in part why the polarization has occurred, because the stakes are really, really, really high. I mean, many-fold what they would have been 100 years ago.
So,
Bruce, thank you so very much for your presentations. They're always wonderful. I would like to call your attention to two statements that you repeated, and that had to do with Congress and being responsive to literally criminal actions. We have a person occupying the Oval Office who is a criminal. He's a convicted criminal, felony. You mentioned felons. He is a sexual criminal for that too. And unfortunately, over 100 women that were some paid off and so forth, not to bring their cases before any courts. So what do we do? And I've been traveling overseas since before the inauguration and after, and in Europe, and they are just dumbfounded that the American people voted for a criminal. How would you respond to that?
I don't think that there was any concealment. The American people knew what their choices were. I think, if you want to call it a credit to Trump, he had presaged exactly what he was going to do when he said, under Article 2, I have the right to do anything I want as president, and he made various other statements of the same sort. Now, why the American people voted for him? It wasn't just voting for Trump or against him in isolation. Kamala Harris obviously didn't think was a worthy challenger. And with regard to the other descriptions you have of him, that was where things that predated, his election. My focus is on, what he should be held accountable when he's done since he's been elected, under the very, very strong theory that elections don't repeal constitutions. As one of our justices once said, in a famous case, that the Bill of Rights doesn't depend upon the outcome of any election. And it's not true that you have an electoral mandate and you can just run through the Constitution. Franklin Roosevelt, who had vastly more mandate than Trump, just based upon popular and electoral votes, he got 77 statutes in his first 100 days. Statutes. Trump, the statute? No, I just issue executive orders. Wake up. Why do I need the legislative body? Those are the things that, at least in my judgment, is consistent with the rule of law and democratic theory, or electoral theory. We can legitimately say, well, you've committed impeachable offenses since you've been elected. So we couldn't have ratified them in advance. The other things, I don't necessarily applaud it, as I haven't voted for either major party candidate in like 40 years. I write in James Madison or George Washington because I don't want to pollute the piece of paper there with another name. I want to stay politically active, but I can't endorse either side. That's so ruthless when it comes to the Constitution. So that's all I would say. But the system is supposed to work if the process is appropriate. Just because the voters voted for Trump doesn't mean that he can decide to violate the Constitution, which is basically what we're seeing today. And I say, not just him. Unfortunately, we went through one session. Presidents have been doing that for over 100 years with impunity. And I'll repeat what we've said over and over again. Once a country decides that it wants to be an empire and rule the world, we did it at least the Spanish-American War with Albert Beveridge, self-determination, self-government. That's only for the white people who are smart, not the native Filipinos. You have to have a Caesar. You cannot be an empire without a Caesar. You can't have a collective, right? What Napoleon once said, the only thing worse than one great general is two great generals, because they competing with each other. And once we had a commitment, and I think that persists to this very day, it wasn't just Madeleine Albright who said, we only have angelic DNA when we slaughter people, we have their best interests out at heart. It's in the subtext of everything we say and do, whether we wake up one day and say, oh, we're at war with the Houthis. Oh, we're at war with Syrians. I wonder who else we'll be at war with. We've been giving arms to Israel, we've arms to Ukraine, become co-belligerents, Congress is spectator, American people shrug their shoulders. Again, because we still live in this bubble that the greatness of America is how much we can dominate the world. I remember years ago, I was participating in a program that John sponsored. It was someone who was celebrating the Mexican-American War. I wouldn't mention his name. He said it was just we expanded, the territory, got all these new states, and showed that we were tough. And I said, why? We should have never even fought the war. Ulysses Grant, who participated in the war, was the great Union general, later president, said it was the most disgraceful war ever. We just made up lies about what Mexico had done to kill American soldiers on American soil to destroy them. He said it was just like all these European monarchs. And I remember the presenter said, well, Bruce, we couldn't be great unless we got all that Mexican territory. I said, what makes us great is not territory. It's how we rule and govern ourselves, the example we set to others. It's not square miles or square inches you control. And that's why we were so great at the outset with 13 little states on the eastern seaboard. We sent tremors throughout all of Europe. Why? Do we have a gunboat? No. Bullets? No. Bayonets? No. We had an idea that all those monarchs fear. They're terrified. Self-government? Are you kidding? We're gone. That's why they were fearful of the United States. And it shows that's what we were supposed to be about. Inspire others by example, but recognize, no, domination, bigness is not the definition of why we were created in 1776.
Good. Yeah.
John and Bruce, I have a question about the take care clause. How do we enforce the take care clause? I just, looking back at the last administration where the Biden administration refused to enforce the immigration laws. In fact, they turned the Immigration and Naturalization Service and ICE into an illegal immigrant resettlement authority, so that we have 12 million illegal immigrants coming into the country. And of course, I think that probably was a big factor costing not Biden, but Kamala Harris the election. So how do you actually get an enforcement regime in place so that you can make the president take care?
Yeah. Well, it's a wonderful question. Of course, as a preface to the response, you remember early on in his administration, Obama approached Congress, said, here, let's try to get an immigration reform provision. The Congress was balking. So then he created this program by executive order, DACA, Deferred Administrative Action Against Children. He said, well, where does that come from? You just said that you needed to go to Congress to get a statute. You couldn't get it, and so now you're circumventing the whole process. And there have been court challenges that said it's arbitrary and capricious. It's not got back up to this. It was been to the Supreme Court once. But you were pointing out, Bob, a problem across the board. You can't, other than impeachment, you can't, the Congress can't run down and say, here, I want you to take this border patrol and tell them, police this part of the border with Mexico or Canada or any place else. Just like you can't tell a U.S. attorney if he's instructed not to enforce the law, I want you to bring an indictment anyway. Who's going to do that? A court can't do that. The only institution that can force faithful execution of laws is Congress. They have to be able to say, we're going to impeach and remove you if you don't enforce the laws. I say once they did it once, they wouldn't have any further violations. But they don't do that. It's on both sides. They just say, okay, if you don't enforce the law that we don't like, then we don't care about it. And it sets the precedent that creates kind of this vicious circle. It keeps coming back to what he said. Impeachment is the remedy because no court can force, they don't have armed forces, they don't have marshals, force the executive branch if they don't want to do anything. Think of this. In 1957, after Brown against the Board of Education, there was huge Southern resistance to desegregation. So President Eisenhower, he didn't like the decision. He sent the military. He had to send the military to Central High School in Little Rock to let these 9 little girls enter school without being spat on. But he used the military. Suppose he just said, forget it. What happens to the court decree? They don't have any marshals. They don't have any ability to enforce that. It would have been just an empty letter. Unless Congress stood up and insisted that, Eisenhower protect those who were being admitted pursuant to court decree. He said it's pretty simple as to what needs to happen. The politics, however, is much, much more difficult given, where we are today.
So is the answer to Bob's question that the law follows the power now, the power doesn't follow the law?
Well, that's where we are. But when law follows power, it really isn't law. It's just an echo of power. That's the strong do what they can, the weak suffer what they must. But Bob's just pointing out, whether you're Democrat or whether it's whatever law you're talking about, the take care clause, without Congress to reinforce it with the threat of impeachment, it's just a hollow exercise.
Right here on the
Why
front.
do you think Congress doesn't stand up? Do you think that they agree with what Trump's doing, or Biden, they do agree with, so that nullifies the issue of whether it's legal or not? And then you've got the courts involved, and they're not actually stepping up either.
Well, they're doing a little bit, but they're not supposed to be the primary.
But they're sending it back, and then Trump's choosing to disregard some of those court decisions. But so I don't understand why Congress doesn't do more. I've called my congressman, they say they get 20,000 calls a day. I've been on these town hall meetings. Mm-hmm. They're hearing from people, but I think they actually agree with what he's doing, or they're afraid. I don't think they're afraid of not being reelected. I think they're afraid of being assassinated by their constituents.
Well, like all serious questions, there are very seldom single answers. I think that there are multiple components. One, that's surely true if you go up there, they fear Elon Musk with all of his money. They feel they could be primaried and Elon Musk could take after them. Whether those calculations are correct, I don't know. Elon Musk is not as popular as Trump, for sure. But a secondary
But he has a lot more Twitter followers. He's got 400 million.
Yeah, I know.
He's got twice as many followers as Trump.
Yeah, I don't know what that
Twitter.
says about the species when Elon Musk commands 400 million followers. But another consideration is that, by and large, the members are constitutionally illiterate. They don't even know what their powers are. One example, and then, John, you were with me when we were in the Capitol Hill Club.
Yeah.
One of the greatest powers Congress has is called inherent contempt. It's the same power that courts have. If a subpoena is disobeyed, somebody doesn't testify, Congress can put them in jail immediately or fine them. They don't have to go to court. A summary. Well, that needs to be done because in modern life, the executive branch routinely tells Congress, I'm not showing up, I'm not answering questions, I don't want to tell you X, Y, Z. Especially when it comes to explaining who we target for assassination with drones. So we were at an event with freshman Congress, I think. I forget what it was. So I stood up, I forget this one was elected, I think it was from Georgia. I said, well, what are you going to do with use the inherent contempt power to get information out of the executive branch? His eyes glazed over. like I asked him or used a dirty word or something. He had no clue. He just, talked to my aide or something about that. So they don't really understand, how contrary to the Constitution presidents are acting, in part because it's slowly happened. And so all they've known is presidents violating the clause. I mean, the ones that for at least 20 or 30 years, every day, presidents, both parties, they violate the declare war clause, they violate the treaty clause, they do executive agreements instead of treaties, and they violate the Fourth Amendment. They spy on us all. NSA, Ed Snowden disclosed the tip of the iceberg. They don't pay no attention to the Fourth Amendment. And so they become accustomed, this must be legal, because it happens every single day. So they don't know the danger that they're involved in. And then you have another component is the party loyalty. They really think that their loyalty is making sure their party stays in power rather than follow the oath of office, which is uphold and defend the Constitution. And it happens on both sides. So if you're a Republican, you never vote against anything that a Republican president does. If you're a Democrat, you never vote against anything Democrat president does. And that means the president wins all the time because he can easily marshal 1/3, to block any effort to override a veto. So you put and then there's a fourth element too that I mentioned, and that is in this particular atmosphere of empire, there's kind of a belief, you can't really push back too much on the president because you've got all these, there's China out there and there's Russia, and we really need a president with this limitless power. Otherwise, we're going to turn into very, very small. We can't run the world anymore. And we're so accustomed to running the whole world that we feel immediately repulsed by the idea that we would just be an ordinary country whose real power came by the power of example. So you put all those things together, and you basically have a Congress that's anemic, and is disinclined to do anything. They view their jobs as being like movie actors. So they stand up and they say things, but nothing ever happens. Right now, you see there's resistance on the budget, right? Well, maybe there's a few Republicans stand up and they don't like it, and the House is moving back with the Senate bill, but we know what the outcome's going to be, right? It's all going to capitulate and cave. And so Trump will give them a little, $5 here, a few dollars there, but it's largely going to be a Trump budget, which is largely what the Biden budget was because it keeps going up every year. No one wants to cut back anything that's serious, which means the military-industrial complex and the intelligence complex. The other stuff is minor. Okay, you fire all these employees at Peace Institute or whatever. That's that's so small. It's a couple $100,000. It's ridiculous small. But the stuff that really is huge, they're not cutting any Defense Department procurement, weapons systems. No way. Because they're the ones who substantiate where you got to be an empire.
So I think that's a wonderful question, and that if we could get a political answer to that, we could get some traction. But Mike Peabody, who was on our board, died this year, and we went to his service at Grace Church in First Town. And his son picked this thing out in Matthew, which says that the worst, he's saying his father was a great father because he taught us that the worst sin is to know better and not do it. Whereas in the Bible it also says they know not what they do. So when we talk about this epidemic of constitutional illiteracy, right, we're basically saying, aren't we? We're saying basically they know not what they do. Or do they really know? So I would say, you couldn't give you a real answer to your question, but basically I would say that the constitutional literacy is stronger than the willful not knowing knowing that it's the wrong thing and doing it anyway. And so we went to when the Republicans won the House. There was a turnover. What was that? That was 2 cycles ago.
Yeah.
John Curley put me up for the Capitol Hill Club, and we got Congressman Massey, and we got about 12 Republican congressmen there to talk about the Constitution and listen to Bruce talk about the Constitution. And Massey said it was really amazing because trying to get them, and the Republican club's right next to the House building. Whereas the Democratic club is much further away and not as nice. The Republican club is a nicer building. Okay, so it's a nice place. It's easy to get to, and it's really nice. And so he said, getting them over there, getting a dozen congressmen over there, was like, he said, having a wheelbarrow full of frogs. And by the time he got there, they all jumped out. And then when you got them there, and Bruce is telling him, talking about the Constitution like we are tonight, he said it's like reading Shakespeare to your cows. So I think that answer is that they know not what they do. And that's the constitutional literacy. And so why do we have an epidemic of constitutional literacy? It's not an accident, right? Why do we have it?
It's not only civics education in the law schools. I attended Harvard Law School, John Columbia. They don't teach separation of powers, anything like that.
It's just not
in
taught.
Part because most of the professors at one time, they were in the executive branch, they had some high title or whatever. And they view that as their high water mark in their profession. They're all executive branch creatures. And say one of the problems we have now, I've remarked on this for several years, in the judicial branch, virtually all the appointees have executive branch experience. And I know, because I worked in the executive branch, you just want to bolster the president, make up all the theories you can to strengthen his powers. So Elena Kagan, if you look at the ones, John Roberts, Clarence Thomas, all these people, they had experience in the executive branch. You get that perspective. The last Supreme Court justice who served in the Congress was Hugo Black. Hugo Black, he died in 1971. He was appointed in 1937, almost 100 years ago. So it kind of biases the perspective that the members have, because the executive branch teaches you scorn Congress, make sure you don't write anything down because they may subpoena it, and try to evade what Congress does. And that's a real problem in the institutional decision.
So we're looking for candidates, either Democrat or Republican or independent, that will run on take the Constitution First pledge and make that either the centerpiece of their campaign to run on process rather than policy, or a Democrat that would put that in their quiver and use that as a form of political competition against a Republican, or vice versa. Right? So the way it would happen is you go into, and so right now we've got about 20, it's got to start in the House, not in the Senate. It's where the battleground for making the Constitution great, it's got to be. It's got to be in the House. And there are only 20 seats that aren't gerrymandered, so you don't have any serious political competition. So it's only going to be in those 20 races where it'll make a difference that a Democrat could pull Republican votes, or like in Trump's case, he obviously pulled votes from Democrats to win, right? So if it's a close race and one candidate gets up and says, that if I win this election, if you vote for me, then I am bound by the Constitution to put my hand on the Bible and swear to uphold the Constitution. But we know that that's not what people go through the motions, but either they don't know what they're doing, or they lie, or they're committing perjury. Well, they're committing perjury.
I think that if
Right.
you want verification of that, go back and you can read, the first were called the Annals of Congress, then it was the Congressional Globe, and now it's called the Congressional Record. Go read the language, the type of debates that were held, the earlier Congress, really up until after the Civil War, through the Congressional Globe. The references, the sophistication they had. Go look at Congressional Record today. I can guarantee you, you'll see a universe of difference. Yeah. Say it's like from reading Shakespeare to reading Babel from a first grader. And that's just evidence of the decline in the literacy in general, because we don't teach civics, we don't teach English, we don't teach speaking, we don't teach critical thinking, how we live. And the result pays. It goes back to what Thomas Jefferson said. To expect to live free in a state of ignorance, if a nation expects to live free in a state of ignorance, it expects what never was and never can be. Without education, self-government is a fool's errand.
Good.
Hi.
Hope we took a good chance. I hope we did a running start at answering that question.
But you did a good answer.
I need to respond to that, because am I encouraged? No. But we cannot give up and cease trying because it looks bleak. You cannot do that. I repeat so many times, the very first person on the planet who said slavery is bad probably got killed. He had no chance of succeeding. The very first person who said women aren't chattels had no chance of succeeding. But if that person didn't exist, we'd still be living as barbarians. So we need to play that same role if we have to. It's not something you welcome, but if you have to do it, we do it.
Because it's the right thing to do. It's not a probability analysis. We've got a question right there.
Hi, thank you so much for this conversation today. It's been really enlightening. My name is Eliza, and I feel like this conversation is more important now than ever, and it seems like both political parties, both presidents from both parties are really comfortable now with violating the laws of our country in subtle or not so subtle ways. And I'm curious about, in more modern history, when this started, not because I'm interested in looking at which president or which party may have started this ball rolling, but because I'm curious about the political context of the time that started to allow presidents to take these bolder steps. Is that a fault of Congress, or is that a fault of our own kind of people not being as active and engaged? So I'm curious about the political context of the time that started this. Thanks.
Well, Congress reflects, ultimately the public opinion. They're not kind of independent actors. They have to go back and get elected every 2 years or every 6 years in the Senate. I say the most dramatic, if we want to call inflection point in our politics, was the annexation of Hawaii in the Spanish-American War, where we openly and notoriously said, we need to conquer the world. God has made us the new chosen people. And like he took the Jews out of Egypt and conquered all of Canaan, that's what we need to do. That self-government only applies to white people who are smart. Even at that point, you remember, women didn't have the franchise amendment, and Woodrow Wilson, who wanted to run abroad to save the world for democracy, was suppressing the right to women at home. He didn't see any contradiction in that, although certainly women did. I don't think you had need to be a woman to see that contradiction. But that was the time when I believe that given our economic growth and strength, and the military development. Remember, Teddy Roosevelt said our Navy all around the world. It became a real option to be a world power. It really was more theoretical than otherwise before then. But now we're passing Germany and Great Britain and number of tons of steel that we produced and the boats and all this stuff. So I repeat, we had a Faustian bargain to confront. Now we could be the successor to the British Empire if we wanted to. And we couldn't resist, like Faust. All these great things. We get vicarious thrill telling other people how to live. And the British, they had all these famous poets, and Rudyard Kipling told us that we had a white man's burden in the Philippines to tell these Malaysia, you're too stupid to govern yourself and we need to conquer. And once, say, you then have a totally revolution, I call it counter-revolution against the idea of government 1776. Once you've decided that your national purpose is totally different, it's to dominate the world. I say, you got to have a Caesar. You can't dominate the world without a Caesar. De facto or de jure. And that's what happened. If you take, for example, the British Empire, they don't have a presidency, right? They get a prime minister, parliament. But in the empire, de facto, the prime minister was a king. Whoever thought, you read about the British in the 1800s, you read about who? Disraeli and Gladstone, nobody else. You read about World War II, who was it? Winston Churchill. Did we even think that Parliament existed in World War II in Great Britain? No, it's Churchill did everything. Because he's still trying to keep the empire, so you have to have just one person. And that's something that I think that our civics refuses to teach. That was what I call the inflection point, where we flipped from being a country that celebrated our glory as liberty and the march of the mind to one that celebrated empire and domination and control. And John Quincy understood that as early as 1821. Didn't pay any heed to it.
Yeah, so my that's great, Bruce. What we do with the committee, because our politics in America are so, the lanes of political competition are so restricted, right? So Reagan gave us the social issues, and Trump's given us immigration, and the environment used to be, Nixon started the EPA and, went after the catalytic converter, but now the environment's become subject to political competition. And you have healthcare, the Obamacare. So those ones, but the money and the violence, the largest empire in the history of the world is ours. I mean, we're spending $1.5 trillion on it, but it doesn't exist politically, right? Because if the tree falls in the woods and no one's there to hear it, did it make a sound? If it's not talked about, because basically both parties have swallowed this idea that we're basically a chosen people, and that there are good guys in the world and bad guys, and we're the good guys. And so you have this kind of schizophrenic politics where at election time we're always told that this is the most important election, right? How many times you hear that every 2 years or 6 years or 4 years, whatever the cycle is for the office, we're told that this is the most important election we've ever had. And then they compete on this very narrow group of domestic issues. But then, and if the other side wins, then, we're existential, right? We got to get the country back from the other party, or, and so we go through that routine. And then after the election, then we all kind of go along with this idea that we should spend $1.5 trillion that we don't have, right, on all this military stuff, right? And, which means, as David Stockman said in the January testimony in his salon, that we're spending over $200 million on an army, and $200 billion on an army, over $200 billion on a Navy, that really aren't, most of that money is not going, it's about power projection. It's not really about defending America. So that's silent, right? So that's what we do here, is we talk about it. We go where the silence is, and where the silence is loudest, and the silence is where the power is. And it's what people don't talk about. right? All this military spending, and then the two big default banks, we do that. And then Israel's really a subsidiary of the warfare state, and we do that. So that's kind of our subject matter, and we end up doing that. We'll have a salon in May on, our next salon will be on China. And we'll talk about the political, the whole relationship with China, because we've done salons. The three countries that we think that if you get them wrong, you're going to be in a world of trouble, is Russia, China, and Israel.
Let me comment for a second, because I believe the framers wouldn't have conceived of that. They wouldn't have said that there are certain countries that are critical. They say, listen, we have invincible self-defense. We engage, we trade, we talk, but we fight only to defend our own. Not because it means the world's going to be perfect. Because they understood as soon as we started to fight other people, our whole self-government would go out the window. No longer liberty, it'd all be domination and control, because at wartime is what? The model of war is legalizing first-degree murder. That's a bad thing, right? Destroys all. Due process is out the window. It's not an accident that we had our U.S. Supreme Court, which was good on some other civil liberties, in World War II. They endorsed the concentration camps for Japanese American citizens based on General John DeWitt's statement that because there was no evidence of Japanese American sabotage or espionage, it was a confirming indication that treason was afoot. Okay? That's our U.S. Supreme Court. That's not Alice in Wonderland's Queen of Hearts, sentence first, verdict after. Can you imagine that? Wartime destroys any possibility of freedom and liberty and free speech. Goes out the window. And that's why the framers wouldn't have said Russia, China. So who cares? They would treat every country abroad the same way. Listen, we'll trade with you. We exchange ambassadors. You leave us alone. We'll leave you alone. It's not because the world's going to be perfect. There's going to be tyrannies, and some countries may invade other countries. But we know our cure is worse than the disease because it would destroy us, which is, in fact, exactly what has happened. All the crimes, I mean, Vietnam, the My Lai massacre, I'm sure Cy Hirsch would say that's the tip of the iceberg. It destroys a country. All your morals go out the window. And that's why they would say, what does it matter? You think in George Washington's farewell address, he was talking about, well, these countries we need to be worried about in that one? He said, no, we don't need to have any entangling alliance with anybody. He didn't suggest it was just France or Britain or anyone else. And that's where we've gone astray. And part of it is because I believe we have this kind of messianic idea that, hey, we can make the world perfect, no evil anywhere. So we can make sure nothing Putin does is bad or Z bad. We can't do that. We can't. It'll make things worse. Right. And we have to accept the fact that we have to live with an imperfect world, that it's the optimal, even though there's a lot of misery out there. Because when we intervene, it makes it worse. Think of one of the, you know who the most hated people in Libya are, Libyans viewed today are? Barack Obama and Hillary Clinton. They said, you came over here, destroyed our whole country, we got militias everywhere killing each other. Human trafficking, slavery, everything. Well, I don't think Obama and Hillary Clinton meant that they wanted to turn Libya into a desert or a wilderness, but that's what they did. That's what war does. It's horrible, William Tecumseh, war is hell. If you have to do it, it's self-defense. And that's why the framers understood, hey, it's not going to be perfect, but we just have to make sure that we preserve liberty at home. We influence things abroad by example. And by example, they send tremors all throughout Europe and the monarchs who feared our ideas more than bullets.
Do we have a question right back there? Yeah, I guess we got one. That's got to be the last one. Unless we give a real short answer.
It's a lot of pressure. Thank you both for the discussion. I've enjoyed it immensely. Going back to the supremacy of Congress, I'd like to hear your thoughts on the Congressional Review Act and whether or not it's a blunt tool or if it's necessary to claw back the supremacy of Congress in the face of an expanding bureaucracy, or how you see that shaping up in the current tug of war between the two branches?
I think that the act is somewhat of a good step. It means that certain regulations that are promulgated as the president exiting the White House gets automatic, votes, can't be subject to filibuster in the House and the Senate. But I think it's, again, very anemic. I tried to address the problem differently with members of Congress. I guess this was maybe 10 years ago. I think that the U.S. Supreme Court made a horrible decision in a case called INS v. Chadha, where this is by the 1970s, it was regular that congressional checks on the executive came by establishing what you would call one house or two house vetoes. The executive did something, one house by a majority vote could say, no, we're going to nullify it. Sometimes it was two house veto. But at least it was a recognition that by Congress that we've delegated so much we can't keep track of everything. So we're kind of reserving the ability. If we think the executive branch has gone too far with one house, and what was useful about this approach is the president can't veto a one house or two house veto. Pass it, that ends the regulation. And there was a member from Congress named Ted Yoho, and I drafted a bill to try to reestablish the legislative veto, this is what it's popularly known as, because with the executive branch out of control and Congress persisting in giving these limitless delegations, at least there's some way you could get Congress back into the game. And because the real import and the effect of the legislative veto is before the regulation is issued or the executive branch acts, they go to Congress and say, hey, what can we do to make sure you don't do a legislative veto? So the real effects on decision making are far more profound than what you can see on the surface. Right. Unfortunately, Congress didn't do anything. The one thing that's, I say, defective about the Congressional Review Act, it still is a statute that is presented to the president, and the president can veto it. Now, with regard to the regulations that came at the 11th hour in the Biden administration, that's not happening, but it could happen otherwise. I think it should go back, and this is the Supreme Court got it wrong. They should reverse this decision called INS versus Chadha and restore the legislative veto. It's a practical way, at least, of endowing Congress with more power than they exercise now.
But you'd prefer to go directly at the problem by the delegation doctrine and revive sector poultry and Panama refining.
Yeah, right. I mean, there are other things that can be done.
That's a much better remedy than this Band-Aid approach.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
But anything is at least a step. But I agree. What ought to happen is the U.S. Supreme Court ought to say that these limitless delegations of power, and we see what they resulted most recently in these tariffs, is unconstitutional. The last time they did that was in the Roosevelt administration, saying this was delegation run riot. But this is the statute that Trump has utilized to create all these tariff upheavals. It's called the International Emergency Economic Powers Act of 1977. And it says, in gist, the president can declare a national economic emergency whenever he feels like it. And when he does that, he can do whatever he wants to try to advance the national security. This is the first time it's been invoked by a president to impose tariffs. Nationwide tariffs, up, down, whatever, and he can change them in 5 seconds. Previously, there's a 1962 law that says if you're invoking national security and you're thinking of imposing tariffs, then the Secretary of Commerce has to do a study and have public comment and then make a report to the president, and you can only impose the tariffs product by product, not nation by nation. That's just out the window. It's 1977 statute, just gave the whole thing away.
We had a whole salon on emergency powers,
Yeah.
remember? And at that time, we said this was going to...
Could you imagine, Congress in 1976, they enacted something called the National Emergencies Powers Act. And you know what it doesn't do? It never defines what a national emergency is. It doesn't even give a clue. I mean, how about Congress enact statute say, President shall promulgate an internal revenue code. Okay, go at it.
So we'll take your question, but we got to promise you a short answer.
Well, this will be a happy ending question, okay? So, Bruce, I'm convinced that perhaps you're qualified to run. Maybe you haven't considered, but I think you ought to consider national office, or should have been considered national office at some point. But I want to ask you, let's just play with that idea. If you were going to make some decisions right now, let's just put yourself in that place. What's your priority for the next year economically, the relationship with China, how do we handle that? What should the military budget be? Because I heard this morning they were just talking about $1 trillion around things off right now. You know, we will get our flying vehicles, by the way. We will get our flying cars, which, you know, that we're talking about. We'll get that. But my last question: what would be your priority? How would you have handled the Department of Education and certain NGOs? What would be your platform in general?
It's kind of an overwhelming question.
Process.
Number one, process matters. People who have expectations, whether it would be defended in a court of law or otherwise, they need to be treated fairly. I probably would try to close more of the federal government than Elon Musk, but I wouldn't do it by saying, here's an email, you're gone. Hey, you've put your life in this. Can we do a transition? The important thing is in the right direction. So you've got to treat people decently and fairly. And don't tell them that you're lousy, you don't do a job, stigmatize them, and you're gone. Throw them out like old furniture. So process is important, and I believe in it's called in politics grandfathering in. Okay, we're phasing this out, but the people who are doing the job now, we're not going to throw out on the street. But I just go back. The most important part, the priority, is getting rid of the military-industrial complex against which Eisenhower warned. For two reasons. One, the magnitude of the spending, it's like $1.5 trillion when you throw in all the intelligence budgets and the VA and everything else, plus the interest on the debt that's incurred because we fought wars. But the other reason, and it may even be more important, is that at present, the military-industrial complex, it monopolizes the collective genius. There's so much money and power over there. The really smart people, the J. Robert Oppenheimers, the Edward Tellers, the Enrico Fermis, they go there. They're not Thomas Edison building mousetraps and making life more pleasant to ordinary people not engaged in war. Our genius is being devoted to finding more and more proficient ways to kill other human beings. That, to me, is madness. And all of that intellect then would be devoted towards making the country better, more able to care for those who are handicapped, weren't endowed with many opportunities that we have. We've got plenty of opportunity to do that. But I think that once we stop the military-industrial complex, the other things I would go after in order, because I do think that the government does way, way, way too many things. And I apologize for dilating here, because there's so many what I call collateral effects of big government that are not recognized for the damage to the country and our self-governing institutions and practices. The more you have government involved in life and have them control anyone's destiny, whether it's education department, whether it's FDA or Fed Reserve, SEC, the more you make those who are regulated very reluctant to say anything. If you have free speech, but you need a drug confirmed by the Food and Drug Administration and past safety and effectiveness, causing hundreds of millions of dollars, and I know this. We can't say anything against free speech, criticize the FDA. What's going to happen? They're going to sit on our drug application, we lose $1 billion. So they shut up. So it creates a very, very suffocating self-censorship in the citizenry, the larger the government is. That doesn't mean you don't make the government zero, but it means you have to have a presumption against it. Because to my mind, that's far worse to have self-censorship than to have the government weaker than it ought to be. It's once said that freedom is when the government is fearful of the people. Tyranny is the opposite. People are fearful of the government. And we have, I think, turned that balance upside down.
Well, thank you very much. Very, very thank you. Good job.